January of 1910. Somewhere in rural Ohio, the horizon was pale before first light. A farmhouse stood silent in the cold, its wooden walls drifting thin spirals of smoke from a low hearth fire. Kerosene lamps, their glass chimneys smudged from use, waited on tables and shelves, gathering dust in the early morning gloom. Outside, frost clung to the fields, encasing fence posts and tools in a fragile crystal sheen. The air was brittle with winter's chill. Before dawn, the world remained without electric power. The world waited for the sun to lift its rays over the quiet landscape. Within the farmhouse, the day began as it had for generations, with fire, manual labor, and an intimate awareness of the passing of hours. Buckets stood ready near the back door. The well, a few dozen yards distant, would release its cold water into waiting pails when the first hand of the family broke its stillness. Breakfast awaited preparation over the wood cookstove. There was no hum of wires, no gentle flicker of electric bulbs, no warm, even light to fill the room. Only flame and shadow greeted those who rose before sunrise. In moments like these, in thousands of places across the American countryside, the absence of electricity was not an abstraction but a lived reality, shaping the rhythm of every day. In the earliest years of the 20th century, life for most Americans outside city limits lacked the defining feature of modern infrastructure: access to consistent electric power. Urban centers had begun to adopt electric lighting and mechanized systems in the closing decades of the 19th century, but the countryside remained on another schedule entirely. Where cities boasted street lamps and factories animated by dynamos, rural homes labored without such conveniences. The contrast was stark, and it reflected a nation straddling two eras, one still bound to the muscle of humans and animals, and another already moving toward the silent force of electrical currents running through wires. In place after place across the vast expanse of farmland, daily life followed a pattern dictated by natural light and the physical needs of subsistence. Dawn signaled a beginning of work, an orchestration of tasks meant to carry a household through its obligations long before dusk dimmed the world again. The absence of electricity influenced every aspect of life: how food was stored, how water was obtained, how clothes were kept clean, and how time itself was measured. As the sun spread its light across fields and forests, so too did human bodies and minds stretch to occupy what little daylight they were granted for labor. In the home, morning routines were both meticulous and burdened with labor. Water was drawn in pails from a well or a nearby stream. On cold mornings, the water was ice cold, its surface crusted with crystals that resisted the first dip of a wooden bucket. Each pail required a pair of hands steady at the rope, drawing the heavy load up and out of the earth. The water would be carried into the kitchen for cooking and washing, its weight a constant reminder that no machine stood nearby to ease the task. Food preservation was a cycle rooted in nature and manual effort. Before electric refrigeration, perishables were stored in iceboxes or cool cellars insulated with blocks of ice. These blocks were harvested from frozen lakes and ponds in the depths of winter, then stored in shaded ice houses. Layers of sawdust and straw slowed the melting through the warm months. As the seasons turned towards spring and summer, the remaining ice in the icebox grew thinner, and families learned measured restraint in their use of cooling space. Butter, milk, meats, fruits, and vegetables all depended on this fragile reservoir of ice to resist spoilage. The kitchen hearth was the center of the home, as indispensable as the rising sun. It provided warmth, a place to cook, and the heart of family routines. Before electricity, this hearth, fed by wood or coal, was the site of all meals, heated water, and conversations. Here, hands kneaded dough for bread, stirred stews in iron pots, and tended the flame to ensure that meals were prepared well and without waste. A watchful eye was needed for every ember. Too little fire and the food would cook slowly or not at all. Too much, and the flame could scorch the pot or burn the room with unwanted smoke. Cleaning and laundering clothes was another labor-intensive routine. Wash day came once weekly or bi-weekly rather than daily. Before electric washing machines, clothes were scrubbed by hand. A washboard leaned against a wooden tub, and hands, sometimes raw from cold and soap, worked garments against its ridged surface. Boiling water heated on the hearth softened stubborn stains. After washing, clothes were lifted and wrung by hand before being laid out to dry on lines strung across yards or porches. The process consumed an entire morning or afternoon, and it was done without machines that today we take for granted. Light itself was a commodity measured in brightness and quality. Kerosene lamps, candlesticks, and oil lanterns provided the few sources of illumination once dusk fell. The light from these sources was limited, sometimes warm and welcoming, sometimes sputtering in drafty corners of a room. To read by such dim light required patience and a measured devotion of focus. There were no overhead bulbs to flood rooms with brightness, no switches to banish shadows. Instead, human tasks were guided by flame, and by the slow march of sunset toward the horizon. Water for bathing meant more than turning a faucet. Wood stoves heated pots of water that were carried into makeshift bathing spaces. One tub at a time, family members took their turn in a succession of warmed water that inevitably cooled with each passing moment. Bathing was not a daily practice for most rural families in this era. Instead, it was a ritual often confined to a particular day of the week, when time and labor could be devoted to the task without impeding other necessities. For thousands of farm families, indoor plumbing was rare. Instead, outhouses stood behind homes at the edge of yards, simple wooden structures shielded from view. In the dark hours of night, individuals carried lanterns across frost-hardened ground to reach these facilities, their light guiding each step toward a small, solitary space that served its necessary purpose. The distinction between city and countryside was one of the most tangible markers of the times. In cities, electric streetcars rumbled along rails, powered by the newly installed overhead wires and centralized power plants. Factories in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Detroit buzzed with machinery animated by electrical motors. Magnificent skyscrapers rose with electric lights blazing along upper floors and facades. Yet just miles beyond city limits, fields lay dark and homes stood silent without the quietly humming wires that defined modernity. This divergence did not happen by accident. Private utility companies, the entities that built and sold electric power, pursued profit in places where population density ensured rapid returns. Cities and industrial centers met that criterion. Rural areas did not. Farmhouses widely scattered across incomparably vast distances presented infrastructure challenges that utility companies deemed too costly. Electricity was, for a time, a convenience available to some but not to others. That fact alone shaped daily life, economic opportunity, and the very texture of community life for large segments of the population. Labor on the farm was itself organized around the rhythms of nature and human energy. Work began with animal-powered plows turning soil in the cool of spring and continued through the rigors of summer harvests, fall sowing, and winter woodcutting. Horses and oxen pulled heavy equipment. Sacks of grain were filled and loaded by human and animal strength. Without electric-powered tractors or harvesters, every seed planted and every crop gathered required coordination, sweat, muscle, and patience. Schoolhouses, too, bore the imprint of life without electric power. In remote regions, one-room schoolhouses served multiple grades at a time. Coal or wood stoves heated the interior through colder months. Windows admitted whatever daylight was available. As dusk approached, teachers relied on the waning glow of afternoon light to guide lessons. There were no electric fans in summer to bring coolness, no electric lights to extend the day. Education itself existed within the constraints of the natural environment. Churches, community halls, and social gatherings occurred within similar bounds. Sunday services in rural chapels were illuminated by oil lamps. Social events took place only while daylight lingered. Long evenings often brought gatherings around pianos or fiddles, where families and neighbors shared music not through radio waves, but through the immediacy of presence. The rural post office, general store, and blacksmith shop, centers of social connection, all operated without the benefit of electric power, their daily schedules at the mercy of daylight and shifting seasons. Into this context of manual effort and absence of electric convenience came change, slow, uneven, and fraught with cost and challenge. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, public debate simmered on the question of how to bring electricity to rural areas. Advocates argued that access to electric power would improve productivity, alleviate labor burdens, and elevate the quality of life for the majority of Americans who still lived on farms or in sparsely populated areas. In 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order creating the Rural Electrification Administration, an agency tasked with extending electric lines into the countryside. The following year, Congress passed the Rural Electrification Act, authorizing federal loans to cooperatives willing to build and maintain electrical distribution systems for rural residents. The act signified a federal commitment to overcome the private sector's reluctance to electrify sparsely populated regions. Farmers organized cooperatives to apply for these loans, pooling their resources to build the infrastructure that would deliver electric power. Before rural electrification, fewer than 1 in 10 farm homes had electric service. Some households used small gasoline-powered generators to run a few lights or power a radio, but these systems were limited in scope and reliability. Where electric lines finally reached rural communities, the dramatic effects became immediately evident. Lights replaced kerosene lamps, allowing households to extend the working day beyond sunset without strain. Electric pumps drew water from wells into kitchens and barns, eliminating the daily chore of hauling heavy buckets. Radios powered by electricity connected families to news, music, and cultural voices that had once felt distant. Refrigerators, electric-powered, extended the life of perishable foods beyond the fragile limits of iceboxes. Washing machines and electric irons reduced the physical burden of household chores. These developments did not instantly transform rural life, but they initiated a shift in the nature of labor, freeing time previously devoted to the most onerous tasks. The labor saved by electric conveniences allowed farmers and their families to devote more attention to other aspects of life. Children who once completed chores at dawn and dusk could attend school with less distraction from crushing manual work. Social life expanded as evenings, once constrained by darkness and fatigue, allowed quiet conversation or community events under electric lights. The return on electrification was seen not only in efficiency, but in the texture of daily existence. By the end of the Second World War, electrification had advanced significantly. Returning soldiers, accustomed to electric conveniences in military and urban life, expected the same at home. During the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the pace of rural electrification increased. Federal funding sustained new construction of electrical lines. By 1950, over 3/4 of American farms had electric service. The transformation continued through that decade and into the next, moving toward near universality. By the mid-1960s, the landscape of American rural life had been reshaped. Electricity, once a distant promise, had become a tangible feature of nearly every household. Where the mornings had begun with lantern flame and weary backs preparing for another day of muscle-driven labor, homes now brightened with the flick of a switch. Water pumped through pipes with little notice. Refrigerators hummed quietly in kitchens. Radios offered morning and evening company tuned to distant voices. The changes wrought by electrification did not erase all hardships. Farming remained hard labor, shaped by the weather, markets, and the perpetual uncertainties of agriculture. Yet the presence of electricity offered a foundation upon which mechanical innovation, expanded education, broader communication, and deeper economic integration could rise. The day-to-day work of rural life, once defined by the limitations of muscle and daylight alone, now bore the imprint of technology harnessed to human purpose. Those who had lived before widespread electrification remembered the days when lamplight guided evening tasks and water was a burden carried in pails. They recalled the nights lit only by stars and fire, when household labor extended into the small hours by virtue of necessity rather than convenience. For them, the arrival of electric power marked not merely a technical change, but a renewal of possibility, a shift in the terms of daily existence. Life before electricity in the United States was not uniform. It varied by region, by wealth, and by proximity to towns and cities. Yet in its broad contours it shared a pattern, an existence bounded by the mechanics of manual labor, guided by the cycles of nature, and reliant on ingenuity within the limits of the technologies then available. The coming of electricity, slow in its reach, irreversible in its impact, marked a fundamental realignment of how Americans lived, worked, and connected with one another. In looking back, the landscape of homes and farms as they once stood becomes a testament to human endurance, a record of efforts tethered to daylight and flame. But it also highlights the transformative power of infrastructure, policy, and collective resolve to bridge the divides of geography and circumstance. What had once been dark and distant became illuminated and immediate. What had once been measured by physical toil became measured in the hum of electric current. Through these changes, a country moved from the exigencies of muscle and candlelight toward the quiet flexibility of a world defined, at last, by electricity.